Believe it or not, at my own birthday celebration, my daughter-in-law called me a pathetic old woman who was ruining their reputation with my poverty. My son nodded in agreement. That was the moment I snapped and told every guest about the $3 million I had secretly loaned to her parents. What happened next changed our family forever. My name is Margaret Collins and I am 64 years old. All my life I taught economics at the University of Miami, but very few knew about my second profession. In the evenings and on weekends, I worked as a private investment consultant. Over 30 years, I built up a fortune that would surprise even the wealthiest people in our city. I have a son, Brian, 37, a successful attorney. I raised him alone after my husband, Thomas, died in a car accident when Brian was only 9. Those years were the hardest of my life. I worked 2 jobs just to pay for his private school and later his college tuition. But I never once regretted those sacrifices. 3 years ago, Brian married Vanessa Reed. She's beautiful, well-educated, and works as an interior designer. Her parents, Charles and Evelyn, own a chain of restaurants across Florida. From the very beginning, I sensed that Vanessa looked down on me, even though she tried to hide it. I live in a small house right on the ocean in quiet Coral Gables. The house is modest, but I love waking up to the sound of waves and falling asleep under a starry sky. I drive an old 15-year-old Honda Accord, buy groceries in regular supermarkets, and dress simply. To everyone around me, I was just another retiree surviving on a teacher's pension. No one knew my investment portfolio was worth $8 million. No one suspected I owned shares in several major companies and properties in 3 states. I deliberately kept my wealth hidden because I wanted people to value me for who I was, not for my money. The first 2 years after the wedding felt magical. Brian and Vanessa often came over for dinner. We celebrated holidays together. Vanessa was polite, though I sometimes caught her eyes scanning my house, my clothes, my car with thinly veiled judgment. I could see her disappointment that her mother-in-law didn't fit the lifestyle she wanted to project. Gradually, the visits became rare. When they did come, Vanessa often suggested I downsize to save on utilities. She offered to help me find a cheaper car or show me discount stores. Each suggestion cut at my dignity, but I stayed silent. Brian started to change too. He called less often, and when he did, he always asked if I needed financial help. His voice carried genuine care, but also pity. My own son had started seeing me through his wife's eyes as a poor old woman who needed support. And then everything changed. 3 years ago, Vanessa's parents reached out to me. Charles Reed called one evening, his voice trembling with desperation. Their restaurant business was on the verge of collapse due to bad investments and a drop in tourism. They needed an urgent $3 million loan to avoid losing everything. Charles admitted he had heard from mutual acquaintances that I was good with money and might know an investor. He had no idea I was the very investor they were praying for. The fear in his voice was so raw that my heart clenched. I thought about Brian, about how he would suffer if his wife's family went bankrupt. I pictured Vanessa, who despite her flaws genuinely loved my son. In that moment, I made the decision that would change everything. I agreed to lend them the money, but under one condition: no one could ever know the money came from me. When I signed the documents in my lawyer's office, my hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from a strange foreboding. Charles and Evelyn Reed sat across from me, pale with stress yet overflowing with gratitude. They believed they were receiving help from an anonymous investor. And I looked at them knowing I was handing over millions to people who thought I wasn't worthy of their respect. The loan was drawn up properly, private financing at 5% annual interest, with monthly payments over 7 years. Everything was airtight, legally flawless. The next day, $3 million left an account Charles and Evelyn could never have connected to their poor mother-in-law. For 6 months, everything went according to plan. Payments arrived on time, the Reed business stabilized. Vanessa even became kinder toward me, though now I knew why her parents were once again funding her expensive tastes and travels. But soon the payments began to lag. first by a few days, then weeks. 8 months ago, they stopped altogether. Whenever I called Charles, he apologized and promised to fix it, but no money ever arrived. Then I learned something that made my hand shake as I held the phone. My attorney, Patricia Williams, discovered by accident that the Reeds had been researching legal procedures for declaring elderly people incompetent. They were exploring ways to strip me of control over my finances. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the ocean outside my window, realizing the very people I had saved from ruin were planning to destroy my life, and that my own son unknowingly was helping them. The waves crashed against the shore as if the ocean itself echoed my pain. And that was only the beginning. After that phone call with my attorney, Patricia Williams, I couldn't sleep until morning. I lay in bed listening to the ocean and torturing myself with the thought of what I had just learned. The Reed family had been researching procedures to declare me legally incompetent. That could mean only one thing: they planned to brand me insane so they wouldn't have to repay the $3 million they owed me. At that point, I had nothing but suspicions based on rumors Patricia had heard from her contacts in the legal community. I needed real proof, documents, facts, undeniable evidence. The next morning, I called Patricia again and asked her to help me find a way to get detailed information about the Reed's plans. She recommended a private investigator, Marcus Thompson, a former police officer with an impeccable reputation who specialized in financial schemes within families. She had worked with him before and trusted his professionalism. We met at a small cafe downtown. He was in his 50s, with sharp grey eyes and a calm, deliberate way of speaking. I told him about the loan, about the missed payments, and about my daughter-in-law's parents probing into incompetency laws. Marcus listened silently, occasionally nodding. When I finished, he explained that he had seen many similar cases, adult children or relatives trying to declare the elderly incompetent to seize control of their assets, especially when millions of dollars were at stake. I hired Marcus to conduct a full investigation into Charles and Evelyn Reed, owners of the Florida restaurant chain. I needed to know who they were meeting, what documents they were preparing, and whether they had specific plans against me. He warned the work would take weeks, but promised to deliver a full report the day before my anniversary celebration. The waiting was torture. Every day I checked my phone, hoping for an update from Marcus. Every night brought insomnia, filled with anxious thoughts about what he might uncover. And I ask you, could you calmly wait, knowing your own family might be plotting against you? Meanwhile, I observed my son, Brian. At 37, my lawyer's son began calling more often, but his voice sounded strange, worried, and patronizing at the same time. He asked about my health, how I was sleeping, whether I remembered to take vitamins, whether I needed help with groceries. At first, I thought it was ordinary care from a loving son, but gradually I noticed odd patterns. Brian was evaluating me, memorizing my answers. His subtle comments about my repeated stories stung. He would gently remind me that I'd already told him a tale about one of my students, or that I'd forgotten a meeting we planned last week. He even suggested I might consider a preventive checkup with a doctor. It dawned on me. My own son was quietly gathering evidence of my supposed forgetfulness. But why? And at whose request? During those weeks, I was preparing for my anniversary, a grand celebration of 40 years of teaching, to be held at a glamorous Art Deco hotel on Ocean Drive. Brian insisted on a formal event, saying I deserved a beautiful evening after decades of work. The irony was unbearable. My son was planning my party, not realizing it might become the stage for my fight for freedom and dignity. I made a guest list of 50 people, colleagues, neighbours, family, friends, all of whom knew me as a modest economics professor. I arranged professional equipment for a presentation, hired a photographer, planned every detail. If Marcus found proof of a conspiracy, my anniversary would become not just a celebration, but a public exposure. As the weeks passed, I walked through my oceanfront house, staring at family photos of Brian's graduation, his wedding to Vanessa, holiday gatherings. I realized these might be the last happy memories we would ever share. If my suspicions proved true, everything would change forever. No more secret financial help for my son. No more family dinners. Only the truth, harsh, painful, but necessary. Those thoughts circled endlessly in my mind. Vanessa, my designer daughter-in-law, also played a role. Her polite questions about my health, her offers to help with chores, her advice on saving money, all of it might have been part of the strategy to build a case against my incompetence. When she suggested I move into a smaller apartment or buy a cheaper car, I no longer heard concern. I heard attempts to paint me as a woman incapable of making rational financial decisions. Every word could be weaponized against me. Her parents, Charles and Evelyn, also started visiting more often. They asked about my retirement plans, my health, how I managed my finances. Now I realized these innocent conversations might have been part of their evidence gathering. What alarmed me most was their reaction to my stories. If I repeated something, they exchanged meaningful glances. If I forgot a detail, I could almost see them making mental notes. I learned to play a role. I acted like a frugal retiree struggling to make ends meet. I complained about grocery prices, worried about party expenses, asked for tips on saving money. But inside, I was seething furious at being studied like a lab rat. Each evening, I sat on my terrace, staring at the ocean, waiting for Marcus's call. He gave occasional updates but withheld details. All he said was that the case was more complex than expected, and that the Reeds were indeed taking active steps. A week before the anniversary, Marcus told me the investigation was nearing completion. There was something in his voice, an urgent warning. He promised to deliver the full report the day before my celebration, giving me time to decide my next move. I knew a turning point was coming. Soon, I would learn the truth about what the Reed family was planning. I would find out whether my son was involved. And then I would have to choose to stay silent or fight. The final days before the event, I felt a strange calm, like a warrior before a battle, outwardly composed, but burning with determination inside. And then, the day before the celebration, Marcus called. His voice carried something that froze my heart. What I learned next was worse than all my darkest suspicions. The meeting with private investigator Marcus Thompson took place the day before my anniversary, in the same cafe where we had first met weeks earlier. But this time his face was grim, and in his hands was a thick folder of documents. The moment he sat down across from me, I knew from his eyes the news would be devastating. Marcus opened the folder and pulled out the first document. It was a contract with Sunset Manor, a private clinic in the Miami suburbs, a facility for elderly patients with mental disorders. A place where people were kept against their will under the guise of treatment. Charles Reed, my daughter-in-law's father and owner of the restaurant chain, had signed this contract just a week earlier. According to the document, a room in the dementia ward had already been reserved for me. The treatment cost was listed at $8,000 a month. I held the paper with trembling hands as the scale of the conspiracy dawned on me. They weren't just planning to steal my money, they wanted to lock me away, strip me of my freedom, and confine me until the end of my life. The next document was even worse. A forged medical report diagnosing me with dementia, signed by Dr. Richard Harrison, a psychiatrist with a dubious reputation. For $15,000, he had fabricated a diagnosis based solely on the testimonies of the Reed family. The report described my progressive cognitive disorder, my irrational financial behavior, and recommended immediate medical intervention and guardianship. Every word was an insult to my dignity and sanity. But the most painful revelation came from the audio recordings Marcus had obtained through his contacts. He pressed play on a small recorder, and I heard my son's voice. Brian, my 37-year-old lawyer son, was telling Charles Reed about my supposed oddities. How I repeated the same story about students several times. How I forgot about a meeting we had scheduled. How, in his opinion, I urgently needed medical help. Charles responded with feigned sympathy, convincing Brian that I truly needed protection from myself. That the family had to take responsibility for my well-being before it was too late. And what would you feel hearing your only child helping strangers plan your imprisonment? Each word cut me like a knife. My son, the boy I had raised alone, the one I gave my whole heart to, was gathering evidence against me. He truly believed he was protecting his mother, blind to the fact that he was being used as a weapon in my destruction. Marcus then showed me another document, the Reed's action plan for the days following my anniversary. According to it, Brian was supposed to sign a petition declaring me incompetent right after the celebration. The next day, I would be taken to Sunset Manor under the pretense of a medical evaluation. In their version of events, I was a crazy old woman who had imagined a $3 million loan. A woman who had lost her grip on reality and become a danger to herself. My money would be placed under family management, which really meant Charles and Evelyn Reed. When Marcus finished his report, I sat frozen. I pictured the white walls of a ward, nurses treating me like a child, years of isolation. This wasn't just financial fraud, it was an assault on my freedom, on my very identity. That's when I realized the anniversary would be my last chance to remain myself. If I didn't act now, tomorrow it might be too late. I decided to prepare copies of every document and a full presentation. My 50 guests would learn the truth, and not just about the loan, but about the plan to lock me away. That night, I returned home and took immediate action. I contacted the banks and revoked every financial guarantee I had secretly given to support Brian's business. I transferred assets, closed credit lines, and blocked opportunities he didn't even know existed. If he believed I was incapable of rational decisions, then let him survive without my irrational help. Each step was painful. A mother's heart tears apart at betraying her own child. But I knew it was the only way to show Brian the consequences of his choices. His career had stood on the invisible scaffolding of my guarantees, and now he would face the true cost of independence. At evening, only hours before the party, I sat on my terrace by the ocean preparing the presentation. Bank statements, the clinic contract, the fake medical report, the recordings, everything would be laid bare. I knew tomorrow my life would change forever. There would be no more secret support for an ungrateful son. No more family dinners cloaked in false peace. Only the truth, harsh, painful, but liberating. On the morning of the anniversary, I woke with absolute clarity. I put on my best black dress, the same one Vanessa had once mocked as a sign of poverty. I did my hair, applied my makeup, and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't a pathetic old lady. She was ready for battle. The Ocean Drive hotel glowed in the sunset. The Art Deco facade, palm trees, and ocean backdrop looked like the set of a Hollywood movie. Only the script was mine, and the ending promised to be unforgettable. The banquet hall sparkled. White tablecloths, orchids on every table, crystal glasses shimmering under the chandeliers. Against the main wall, I had set up a large screen for the presentation. Everything was ready for the celebration no one would ever forget. The first guests were my former colleagues from the University of Miami. Professor Johnson, with whom I had worked for 20 years. Dr. Martinez, head of the economics department. They hugged me, congratulated me, spoke about how much they would miss my lectures. I looked into their kind, unsuspecting faces and thought in an hour they would discover their modest colleague Margaret was a secret millionaire and the target of her own family's betrayal. Then came my neighbours. Mrs. Patterson, always worrying about my finances. Mr. Rodriguez, who often offered to fix my car. All of them genuinely cared about poor Margaret, never guessing I could buy their homes without blinking. Brian arrived at 6:30. My son looked exhausted. His business had already begun to crumble after I pulled my guarantees. He hugged me and whispered his gratitude for the party. That moment was especially bitter. Brian was thanking me, unaware that I already knew about his role in the plot against me. Tomorrow, he was meant to sign away my life, and tonight he was celebrating mine. Vanessa appeared by his side in an expensive seafoam-coloured gown. My daughter-in-law was flawless, her smile perfectly rehearsed. She kissed my cheek and congratulated me, not realizing that within an hour her entire scheme would collapse. I looked into her beautiful eyes and saw nothing but calculation. This woman was already picturing me in a locked ward while she spent my fortune. Charles and Evelyn Reed arrived last. They looked confident, even triumphant. Charles shook my hand, Evelyn kissed my cheek, both offering warm wishes. They didn't know I had copies of their contract and recordings in my purse. When all 50 guests had gathered, I rose to give a toast. The hall fell silent, smiles fixed on faces, ready for a modest teacher's speech of gratitude. But I said something entirely different. I began with memories of my career, of teaching students financial literacy, of the importance of distinguishing true friends from users. Guests nodded, expecting clichés about wisdom in friendship. Then I revealed my secret. I spoke of my consulting work and how I built up a fortune over 30 years. Surprised glances flickered around the room. And then I turned on the presentation. On the giant screen appeared bank statements, $8.4 million. Gasps filled the hall. Faces registered shock, disbelief, awe. The next slide showed the $3 million loan to the Reed family. I read the contract terms, the deadlines, the unpaid balance. Transfers appeared on screen, undeniable proof. The room fell silent, eyes darting between me and the Reeds. The modest professor had secretly financed their lavish life. Giles tried to interject, but I clicked to the next slide of their recent bank records, a $200,000 yacht, $80,000 in jewelry, a $350,000 home renovation, all bought with my money while they ignored their debt. And then came the final blow. The clinic contract, the forged medical report, the plan to declare me incompetent, and finally the recordings of Brian and Charles. The hall erupted. Guests shouted, demanded answers. Phones snapped photos. Mrs. Patterson wept openly. Professor Johnson looked as though he'd seen a ghost. I stood at the screen, strangely at peace. The truth was out. Masks had fallen. Everyone could see the Reeds for who they truly were. Charles leapt to his feet, shouting it was all fake, that I was insane. But his words were drowned out by the roar of outrage. The evidence was undeniable. Evelyn tried to slip quietly out, but Professor Johnson blocked her way. Guests surrounded the Reeds, demanding explanations, threatening to call the police. Vanessa sat frozen, pale as chalk. She knew the scheme hadn't just failed, it had been destroyed in public. But the most heartbreaking was Brian's face. My son looked at me in horror, realizing what he had done. His eyes held shock, shame, and a dawning awareness of his role in the plot. He slowly walked toward me and whispered, "Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" His voice wasn't angry, it was broken. He finally saw himself clearly as a weapon used against his own mother. I met his eyes but couldn't explain. How could I tell him his words about my forgetfulness had shattered my heart? Instead, I said, "Tomorrow, all loan documents will be filed in court. The Reed family has 30 days to repay the full amount. And Brian, every guarantee I gave for your business has been revoked. You wanted independence, now you have it." With that, I left the hall, walking away from the chaos and the ruins of illusions. Behind me, voices rose, guests taking my side, demanding justice. Professor Johnson pressed Charles for answers. Mrs. Patterson said she had always known I was a special woman. Their support warmed me, but it couldn't erase the pain of losing my family. I reached my car, hands trembling, and not with fear, but with relief. I had defended myself. The truth had triumphed. But the cost was high. The next day, the newspapers reported the scandal of the secret millionaire's anniversary. The Reed family filed for bankruptcy. Brian lost most of his clients. Vanessa filed for divorce. And I sat in my oceanfront home, reflecting on how justice often comes with a bitter taste. Even then, I didn't know the most important revelation was still ahead. The final revelation came a month after the scandal at my anniversary. I was sitting in my oceanfront home, sorting through documents for the lawsuit against the Reed family, when my attorney Patricia called with news that turned everything upside down. My daughter-in-law Vanessa was pregnant. Not just pregnant 4 months along. She had known even before the anniversary, but kept it from everyone, including Brian. My son only learned about the baby after their divorce. I held the phone with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the horror of it. Somewhere inside Vanessa was growing my grandchild. A baby who might never know his grandmother because of the war I had unleashed. A child destined to be born into a bankrupt family, stripped of everything because of my revenge. Patricia explained the details. Vanessa had hidden the pregnancy because she planned to use it as her final trump card against me. In their strategy, a pregnant daughter-in-law was supposed to trigger my pity, make me forgive the debt for the sake of my future grandchild. But her plan collapsed before it could be executed. Now Vanessa was a single pregnant woman with no means to survive. Brian had lost his job, their house, everything. Her parents had declared bankruptcy and were barely scraping by. That was when I realized my victory had been pathetic. Yes, I had protected myself from betrayal. Yes, I had punished the guilty. But an innocent child would pay the price for the sins of adults. The following days were filled with torment. I walked through the house, stared at the ocean, and thought about the future. What would happen to the baby? Could Brian provide for a family? What kind of childhood would the little one have in such poverty? Have you ever faced a choice between justice and mercy? When the truth is on your side but the price feels too high. I thought about my own childhood after my father's death, about how hard it was for my mother to raise me alone, about the sleepless nights when I heard her crying in the kitchen. Did I really want my grandchild to live through the same? But then, could I really forgive the plan to have me locked away in a clinic? Did the Reeds deserve any mercy after what they had tried to do? If I relented now, would they see it as weakness? In the end, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called my son. We needed to meet, and this time we would talk openly, maybe for the first time in years. We sat across from each other at a small cafe by the ocean. He looked gaunt and shaven, a shadow of the successful lawyer he once was. For a long time, he said nothing. Then quietly, "Mom, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I betrayed you. I helped people who wanted to destroy your life." In his eyes, I saw genuine remorse. Not an act, not manipulation. True understanding of what he had done. Brian realized he had been a tool in the hands of manipulators. He told me how Vanessa had slowly convinced him of my instability. How she twisted every word, every action, turning care into signs of illness. How her father, Charles, backed her up with fabricated medical details. "They preyed on my love for you," Brian said. "They convinced me I was protecting you from yourself, and I was blind enough to believe them more than I believed you." I listened to his confession, torn between anger and maternal love. Yes, he had betrayed me, but he had also been a victim of their scheme. Then Brian told me about Vanessa's pregnancy, about how she had hidden it from him, about the risk that the baby could be born unhealthy because of her stress. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm asking you to think about the child. The baby is innocent, but it will pay the price for the rest of its life." At that moment, I knew I had a choice. Continue the war to the bitter end, bankrupt the Reeds completely and leave my grandchild with nothing. Or find a way to end the conflict without sacrificing justice. "O'Brien," I said, "I am ready to discuss peace, but only on my terms." His eyes lit with hope, but I quickly cooled his enthusiasm. First condition, full public admission of guilt from the Reed family. I want them to officially apologize for planning to declare me incompetent. Everyone must know the truth. Second, partial repayment of the debt, at least $1.5 million over 5 years, guaranteed and court-controlled. Third, Vanessa signs an agreement never to interfere in our relationship again. The child may know her grandmother, but she will not poison its mind with lies. Brian listened silently, calculating. Finally, he asked, "And what about me? You're my son," I told him. "I can't throw you out of my life, no matter how much it hurts, but trust has to be rebuilt over years." The following weeks were consumed by negotiations. The Reeds resisted, bargained, searched for loopholes. But the alternative was total ruin and criminal charges. In the end, they agreed. Charles and Evelyn signed statements admitting they had planned to declare me incompetent to steal my money. Their confessions were published in the local paper. The entire city learned the truth about the Reeds. The family agreed to pay me $25,000 a month. Their property was mortgaged as collateral. Vanessa signed a non-interference agreement. Any attempt to turn the child against me or Brian would trigger full repayment of the debt. But the hardest part was rebuilding my relationship with Brian. He started small, visiting once a week, helping around the house, sharing his job search struggles. We were slowly learning to talk as equals, not as mother-independent child. Gradually, Brian realized the extent of my hidden support for his career. I told him about the clients I had sent his way, about the loans I had guaranteed, about the connections I had quietly leveraged for him. "Why did you hide all this?" he asked. "Because I wanted you to believe in yourself," I answered. "I wanted you to grow strong and independent, not spoiled, living off your mother's money." Bit by bit, our bond began to heal. Brian found work at a small law firm. The salary was modest compared to before, but he was working honestly without my secret backing. And then Emma was born. A tiny girl on a cold February morning. Brian called from the hospital, his voice trembling with joy. "Mom, it's a girl. You're a grandmother." I rushed there and saw her for the first time. A tiny being with dark hair and serious eyes. Emma slept in my arms and I felt my heart overflow with love. At that moment, all the bitterness, anger, and pain faded. What mattered was this little girl who needed a family. Vanessa lay in her hospital bed, pale and exhausted. When she saw me, she began to cry. Not from anger or fear, but relief. She knew raising Emma without my help would be nearly impossible. "Margaret," she whispered, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but Emma deserves a grandmother." I looked at the young woman who had once plotted my destruction and thought about how complicated people are. Capable of cruelty, but also of repentance. "We'll start fresh," I told her. "For Emma's sake." The following months transformed our family. I visited Emma often, helped Brian and Vanessa both financially and emotionally. Not in secret, not with hidden strings, but openly as a grandmother with the right to be part of her family's life. Brian slowly rebuilt his career. Not with my hidden safety net, but with maturity and responsibility. Vanessa changed as well. Motherhood and hardship taught her to value what she had. No more demands for luxury, no more whining about modest living. The spoiled princess was becoming a responsible mother. The Reeds kept up with their payments. Charles worked as a manager in a car dealership. Evelyn became a hostess at a small restaurant. Their old status was gone forever, but they learned to live within their means. I founded a charity for elderly people targeted by financial abuse from relatives. My story spread, and soon dozens came to me for help. I learned that attempts to declare parents incompetent to seize their assets were far more common than I had imagined. My foundation provided lawyers, medical experts, and defense for those at risk. A year later, we celebrated Emma's first birthday at my house by the ocean. Brian, Vanessa, little Emma, even Charles and Evelyn were there. The atmosphere was calm, almost familial. Yes, scars remained. Trust was still fragile. But we were learning to be a family again. Emma toddled across the terrace, her parents snapping photos with pride. Charles helped set the table. Evelyn played with the baby. No one mentioned debt scandals or betrayal. I looked at the scene and thought about the price of forgiveness. A year earlier, I had been ready to destroy them all. Now, we were celebrating together. Forgiveness is harder than revenge. Revenge is quick, satisfying, a rush of justice. Forgiveness takes time, work, and the courage to risk being betrayed again. But as I watched Emma laugh in her father's arms, I knew the risk was worth it. Now, 2 years after the scandalous anniversary, life has found its balance. Not the same as before, but in many ways better. I no longer hide my wealth. I live openly, help those in need, invest in causes that matter. Vanessa often joins Patricia and me in reviewing cases for the foundation. She has changed completely. Just a month ago, while walking with Emma on the beach, she told me, "Margaret, I'm grateful for the lesson I learned. I used to think money was everything. Now I know family and trust are worth more than any fortune." She was no longer the spoiled princess who once looked down on me. Emma is growing up surrounded by love. She has her parents, grandparents, and a family that nearly collapsed from greed but found a way to heal. The Reeds continue paying the debt and live modestly. The lesson they learned was harsh but necessary. Sometimes people must lose everything to discover the value of honesty. Recently, Emma said her first word, "Grandma." She reached for me with her little hands, repeating, "Grandma, Grandma." In that moment, I knew none of it had been in vain. And yet, at night I sometimes wake with unease. I listen to the waves outside and wonder, what if it happens again? What if the trust I've given my family is betrayed once more? The scars will never fully fade. But that's exactly why I cherish every moment: Emma's laughter, Brian's stories of small successes, Vanessa's sincere thanks. My story began with betrayal and ended with forgiveness. It began in loneliness and ended in family. The journey was long and painful, but it taught me to treasure what truly matters. What do you think is justice always more important than mercy? Can betrayal be forgiven for the sake of the next generation? Is it worth risking trust a second time? That's the end of today's story. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? I read every single one. If you'd like more, check out the full playlist linked in the description of this video. New real stories are on the way, and I'd love to share them with you. Hopefully, I'll see you next time. If this journey resonated with you, please hit subscribe and tap the bell so you'll never miss the latest stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, even the hottest drama stories can end with freedom and dignity.